January 17, 1945. The Gothic Line, Northern Apennines, Italy. The snow fell in silence over the ridgeline, each flake catching what little moonlight pierced the mountain clouds. German sentries stamped their feet in frozen foxholes, their breath rising like the ghosts of 1,000 battles already lost. Below them, hidden in the valley fog, something was moving. Not the familiar rumble of Sherman tanks or the methodical advance of white American divisions they had fought for years. This was different. Through the mist came voices, low, rhythmic, deliberate, carrying a cadence that reminded the older Wehrmacht veterans of something they couldn't quite place. Songs that rose from cotton fields and chain gangs, now sung by men in American uniform, moving up a mountain the Germans had sworn was impregnable. In a stone farmhouse, 3 kilometers behind the line, General Lieutenant Otto Fretter-Pico stood over a topographical map, his finger tracing the defensive positions of the 148th Grenadier Division. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had seen Stalingrad's frozen hell and walked away. Italy was supposed to be his redemption, a place where German military doctrine could still prevail, where mountains and winter would do what armies could not. His staff officers gathered around him in the candlelit room, their faces drawn and pale. Not from cold, but from something else. Fear, perhaps, or knowledge. "They will break," Fretter-Pico said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had crushed resistance before. The 92nd Infantry Division, American Negroes. They have no tradition of victory, no warrior culture. They will scatter like leaves when we counterattack. His intelligence officer, Hauptmann Klaus Dieterle, shifted uncomfortably. On the table before them lay captured American documents, interrogation reports, reconnaissance photographs. What they revealed contradicted everything the general believed. Dieterle cleared his throat. "Herr General, perhaps we should consider what? Retreat?" Fretter-Pico's eyes flashed. "From Negroes. The Führer himself has told us these are inferior soldiers, barely trained, pushed forward by their Jewish masters. We hold the high ground. We hold the Gothic Line. We will crush them. And when we do, we will break the entire American advance in Italy." But even as he spoke, even as he pointed to defensive strongpoints that had held against British commandos and Canadian mountain troops, his officers exchanged glances. They had read the reports too. They knew what was coming up that mountain, and some of them had begun to understand that their general's certainty was built not on tactical reality, but on an ideology that was about to collide with something it had never accounted for. Men who had been told their entire lives they were inferior, who had been denied, degraded, and dismissed, now armed with American weapons, American training, and a rage that had been simmering for generations. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers Division, had arrived in Italy in the summer of 1944, carrying a burden no white division ever shouldered. They fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against the Wehrmacht, another against their own country's doubt. American military doctrine in 1945 still operated under the pseudo-scientific racism that had infected Western thought since the 19th century. Official Army reports questioned whether Negro soldiers possessed the cranial capacity for complex tactical thinking. Training manuals suggested they were suitable only for labor battalions and supply duties. Even their own American commanders, many of them white officers from southern states who had never commanded black troops, arrived with low expectations and high prejudice. But the 92nd was different from the support units and service battalions that had come before. These were combat infantry, the first large-scale American Negro division sent into sustained ground combat in the European theater. They came from every corner of Black America. Sharecroppers from Mississippi who had never left their county, factory workers from Detroit's assembly lines, college students from Howard University and Tuskegee Institute, jazz musicians from Harlem, and preachers' sons from Georgia who had memorized scripture and learned to box in the same church basement. They had trained in the Arizona desert, where white townspeople had refused them service at restaurants. They had shipped overseas knowing that German prisoners of war, enemies of the United States, would eat in segregated diners where they themselves were turned away. What the Wehrmacht intelligence officers had failed to understand, what General Lieutenant Fretter Pico could not conceive, was that these contradictions had forged something in the men of the 92nd. They were fighting for a country that did not fully claim them, defending a democracy that did not fully include them. But they carried in their packs letters from mothers who had scrubbed white people's floors, from fathers who had been sharecroppers on land their grandfathers had worked as slaves. They carried the weight of every lynching that went unpunished, every ballot box they had been turned away from, every school their children were forbidden to attend. And they carried something else, a determination to prove once and forever that courage had no color, that valor could not be measured by the melanin in a man's skin. The Gothic Line they now approached was Germany's last major defensive barrier in Italy. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had poured 2 years of engineering expertise into these fortifications, concrete bunkers sunk into mountain stone, interlocking fields of machine gun fire, minefields sown so densely that even mountain goats learned new paths. The peaks themselves were natural fortresses, ridge lines that gave the defender every advantage. British Field Marshal Harold Alexander had called it possibly the most formidable defensive position in the entire European theater. Divisions with proud histories, the British 8th Army, the Canadian 1st Division, Polish 2nd Corps, had bled themselves white against these mountains. Now it was the 92nd's turn, and Fretter Pico was waiting. What the German general expected was confirmation of his world view. He had read the propaganda, absorbed the racial theories that permeated Nazi ideology. He expected poorly coordinated attacks, units that would dissolve under artillery fire, soldiers who would surrender at the first sustained resistance. He had positioned his best troops, veterans of the Russian front, at key strongpoints. He had ranged his artillery with Prussian precision. He had even prepared leaflets to be dropped on American lines after the 92nd's inevitable collapse, propaganda that would demoralize other Negro units and vindicate his theories. His staff, however, had begun to see something different in the intelligence reports. Prisoners taken from the 92nd spoke of intensive training, of officers who demanded excellence, of a division that had internalized a different kind of motivation. One captured soldier, when asked why he continued fighting after his squad was pinned down for 6 hours under mortar fire, had answered simply, "Because they said we couldn't." This was the variable Fretter Pico's equations could not account for. This was the X factor that his tactical brilliance could not anticipate. The attack began not with the expected chaos, but with methodical precision. American artillery, directed by Negro forward observers who called coordinates in voices steady as metronomes, began to dismantle German strongpoints with mechanical efficiency. Then came the infantry, not in the disorganized rush Fretter Pico anticipated, but in coordinated fire and movement tactics, squads covering squads, platoons leapfrogging through machine gun fire, with a discipline that shocked German defenders. Private Lloyd Daniels from Clarksdale, Mississippi, had picked cotton since he was 7 years old, his hands learning the patience of 12-hour days under a sun that showed no mercy. Now those same hands worked a Browning automatic rifle, with the same methodical rhythm, the same refusal to quit before the job was done.
When his squad leader fell, Daniels took command without being ordered, directing his men forward through a vineyard-turned-killing ground, his voice never rising above the conversational tone he'd used calling to his brothers across cotton rows. Corporal James Mitchell, a postal worker from Philadelphia who had never seen combat, found himself pinned down by an MG-42 machine gun nest that had already killed 2 of his men. In his pack, wrapped in oilcloth, he carried a letter from his daughter's teacher, a white woman who had written to tell him his 8-year-old could not attend the school play because of community standards. Mitchell thought of that letter as he fixed his bayonet. He thought of his daughter's face when he had tried to explain why. Then he moved forward, alone, through fire that cut the air like scissors, reaching the German position and ending it with a savagery that surprised even him. These were not the soldiers Freder Pico had planned for. These were men who had been underestimated their entire lives, who had learned to exceed expectations as a form of survival. Every time a white officer had doubted them, every time a training instructor had been surprised by their competence, every time they had proven themselves only to be doubted again the next day. All of it had accumulated into a kind of relentless excellence that could not be broken because it had been forged in a furnace hotter than any battlefield. Within 48 hours, the tactical situation had shifted in ways that made Freder Pico's staff increasingly nervous. The 92nd had not only attacked, but had seized key objectives ahead of schedule. They had taken Monte Cavalloro, a peak that British commandos had failed to capture in 3 previous attempts. They had broken through the first line of German defenses and were pushing toward the second. And they had done it with a casualty ratio that compared favorably to any white division in the theater. Hauptmann Dieterle brought the latest reports to his commander. "Herr General, the 370th Regiment has penetrated our lines at 3 points.
The 371st has taken the village of Azzano. Our counterattack at Monte Belvedere was repulsed with heavy losses. You must recommend nothing," Freder Pico snapped. But there was something different in his voice now. Uncertainty, perhaps. The map before him, marked with blue and red symbols representing American and German positions, told a story his ideology insisted was impossible. "Bring up the reserves. We will launch a coordinated counteroffensive at dawn. We will restore the line." But his staff officers knew what he did not yet fully comprehend. The line was not going to hold. Not because of superior American numbers. The 92nd was actually outnumbered in this sector. Not because of overwhelming firepower. German artillery was still formidable. The line was breaking because every calculation, every tactical decision, every strategic assumption Freder Pico had made was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what motivated the men attacking his positions. They were not fighting for the same reasons German soldiers fought. Wehrmacht troops in Italy by 1945 fought from duty, from fear of their own officers, from the fading hope that some miracle would save the fatherland. The men of the 92nd fought with something more complex. They fought to prove their humanity to a nation that questioned it. They fought to honor parents who had endured what they themselves refused to accept. They fought because they knew that if they failed, every racist theory would be validated, every doubt confirmed, every door that had been cracked open would slam shut again. Sergeant William Thompson, a former schoolteacher from Atlanta, explained it to a war correspondent who had embedded with his platoon. "You have to understand, sir. When we take that hill, it's not just a hill. When we hold that position, it's not just a position. Every time we succeed, we're succeeding for every Negro child who was told he couldn't. Every time we stand when we're supposed to break, we're standing for every man who was lynched for standing up. We're not just fighting Germans. We're fighting history." The symbolic object that came to represent the gulf between expectation and reality was something mundane: American rations. German soldiers on the Eastern Front had learned to fear the sound of Soviet Katyusha rockets, the sight of T-34 tanks emerging from winter fog. In Italy, they learned to fear something else. The moment when they overran an American position only to discover what the enemy had been eating. When German troops captured American supply dumps, they found cases of cigarettes, chocolate bars, canned meat, white bread, coffee that came already ground and packaged. They found medical supplies in such abundance that American medics could afford to leave wounded supplies behind rather than carry them. They found ammunition, stockpiled in quantities that suggested an industrial capacity beyond German comprehension. But most disturbing of all, they found that even Negro units, troops their propaganda had told them were the lowest priority in the American system, ate better than Wehrmacht officers. A German lieutenant, captured near Monte Belvedere, was given a K-ration while awaiting transport to a prisoner camp. He held the small box in his hands, examining the crackers, the canned cheese, the chocolate bar, the cigarettes, the powdered coffee. His interrogator noted that the lieutenant began to weep, not from fear or relief at being captured alive, but from the realization of what this small box represented. Germany's soldiers were starving. The fatherland's cities were rubble. And here, given to a prisoner, given to enemy soldiers whom the Reich had declared subhuman, was more and better food than he had seen in 6 months. "You don't understand," he told the American interrogator. "Your Negro soldiers eat this? Every day? All of them?" When the interrogator confirmed this, the lieutenant was silent for a long moment. "Then we have already lost. Not here. Not in Italy. We lost before we began. You can feed even your lowest soldiers better than we can feed our best. How do you fight such abundance?" But it was not just abundance. It was what the abundance represented. An industrial democracy that could produce not only bullets and bombs, but butter and bread. That could equip millions of soldiers while its civilians at home still ate better than most of the world. Every K-ration, every chocolate bar, every cigarette was a small messenger of a larger truth. That the American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, for all its racism and injustice, could outproduce, outsupply, and outsustain any totalitarian state. The very existence of well-fed Negro soldiers fighting effectively in Italy was a repudiation of every racial theory the Reich had built itself upon. Fretter Pico saw the captured rations. He read the reports of German soldiers trading intelligence for American food. He understood, in a way his ideology would not allow him to articulate, that he was not fighting tactics or strategy. He was fighting an economic system, a productive capacity, an entire civilization that could afford to equip soldiers his nation had deemed inferior, better than he could equip his own elite troops. By the third day, the situation had become untenable. The 92nd had pushed the Wehrmacht back 5 kilometers, had taken every major objective, and showed no signs of the collapse Fretter Pico had promised his superiors. His casualties were mounting. His reserves were committed. And worst of all, his soldiers were beginning to ask questions he could not answer. Why, they wondered, were these supposedly inferior troops fighting with such effectiveness? Why were they willing to assault positions that even veteran German units would have bypassed? Why did they keep coming forward, even after taking casualties that should have broken their morale? The answers, when they came, shattered something in the German defensive psychology. Prisoners from the 92nd, when interrogated, did not express the hatred that Russian prisoners showed, or the fatalistic duty that German prisoners displayed. They expressed something more devastating: determination to prove their worth, to validate their humanity, to open doors for their children that had been closed to them. One soldier,
bleeding from a shrapnel wound, told his German captor, "You think you're superior? My grandmother was a slave. My father couldn't vote. I wasn't allowed to try on shoes in a store in my own country. And I'm still here, still fighting, still going to take that ridge tomorrow. What does that make you?" On January 21st, Hauptmann Dieterle entered Freder Pico's command post with the latest situation reports and a formal recommendation signed by every senior staff officer. The document was terse, professional, and devastating. Request immediate authorization to execute withdrawal to secondary positions. Current defensive line is no longer tenable. Continued engagement will result in encirclement and destruction of the 148th Grenadier Division. Freder Pico read the document slowly. Outside, American artillery was beginning its daily morning preparation. Shells walking across German positions with the methodical precision that had become the 92nd's signature. He looked at his officers, men he had served with through 2 years of Italian campaign, men whose judgment he trusted even when it contradicted his own beliefs. "They're Negroes," he said quietly, more to himself than to his staff. "American Negroes. We should not be retreating from American Negroes." "Herr General," Dieterle replied, choosing his words with great care. "They are American soldiers."
Their skin color has proven irrelevant to their combat effectiveness. Our doctrine was wrong, our intelligence was wrong, our assumptions were wrong, and if we do not withdraw now, we will be destroyed by men we were told could not fight. The silence in the room was profound. Outside, the sound of rifle fire echoed off the mountains, the sound of another German position being overrun, another strong point falling, another proof that ideology could not stop bullets, and racial theories could not hold ridgelines. Freder Pico authorized the withdrawal. The retreat was conducted professionally, as Wehrmacht forces had learned to do during the long years of fighting withdrawal from Russia through Italy. But it was a retreat nonetheless, and every German soldier knew what it meant. They had been driven from positions they were told they could hold. They had been defeated by troops they were told were inferior. And the cognitive dissonance this created rippled through the German defensive network in ways that transcended the tactical. If Negro soldiers could fight this effectively, what else had they been told that was lies? If American industrial capacity could feed even its supposedly lowest priority troops better than Germany fed its elite, what did that say about the economic theories that claimed racial purity led to strength? If a democracy that allowed dissent and debate could produce soldiers this motivated, what did that say about totalitarian discipline? These questions did not come all at once, and they certainly did not lead to mass epiphanies among Wehrmacht troops. But they planted seeds of doubt, tiny fractures in the certainty that had sustained German soldiers through years of increasingly hopeless fighting. The 92nd continued its advance, pushing through the Gothic Line and beyond. They would fight for another 4 months, until Germany's surrender in May 1945. They would take casualties, hundreds of men killed, thousands wounded, because courage does not make one bulletproof, and motivation does not stop artillery. They would face continued skepticism from American commanders, continued racism from their own military system, continued doubt from a nation that celebrated their victories quietly, while broadcasting their setbacks loudly. But they had done something that transcended the tactical victory over Freder Pico's forces. They had proven, in the most rigorous test humanity has devised, combat, that the racial theories undergirding both Nazi ideology and American segregation were built on sand. They had demonstrated that courage, discipline, tactical acumen, and fighting spirit had nothing to do with the pseudo-scientific racial hierarchies that had dominated Western thought for generations. Private Lloyd Daniels, who had survived the assault and would survive the war, wrote to his mother from a captured German farmhouse, "Mama, they told me all my life what I couldn't do, what I wasn't smart enough for, what I wasn't brave enough for. Today, I took a mountain. Tomorrow I'll take another, and when I come home, when I walk down those streets in Clarksdale, they can say what they want, but they can't ever again tell me what I can't do, because I've already done what they said was impossible." General Lieutenant Otto Fretter Pico survived the war. He was captured by American forces in April 1945 and spent 3 years in prisoner of war camps before being released. In his post-war writings, carefully worded to avoid direct confrontation with the new democratic order, he never mentioned the battle against the 92nd Division. He wrote extensively about tactics, terrain, and the challenges of defensive warfare in Italy's mountains. But he never explained why he retreated from the Gothic Line positions he had sworn to hold. His staff officers, interviewed by Allied intelligence officers after the war, were more forthcoming. Hauptmann Dieterle, asked directly about the engagement with the 92nd, gave a response that made it into several historical archives. "We were trained to fight soldiers. We were prepared for tactics and weapons. We were not prepared to fight men who had been told their entire lives they were inferior and had decided to prove the world wrong. That is a different kind of enemy. That is a force that ideology cannot account for." The broader American military establishment struggled with the implications of the 92nd's performance. Official after-action reports praised their tactical achievements, while simultaneously noting special circumstances and limited applicability to general conclusions about Negro combat troops. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They had fought well, often brilliantly, in ways that contradicted established doctrine, and so the doctrine bent and twisted to accommodate the evidence without fully accepting its implications. But soldiers who had served alongside the 92nd, white units that had seen them fight, combat engineers who had watched them assault positions considered impregnable, artillerymen who had supported their attacks, these men came home with different stories. They told their families, their friends, their children, that they had seen something in Italy that challenged what they had been taught. That courage wore many faces. That excellence had no color. That the men who had been told they couldn't had done so anyway. There is a photograph taken in late January 1945 that captures something of the moment's meaning. It shows soldiers of the 92nd resting on a captured German position, their faces exhausted, their uniforms torn and muddy. They are eating K-rations and smoking American cigarettes. In the background, barely visible through the winter haze, are the next set of mountains they will have to take. And beyond those mountains, though none of them know it yet, is the end of the war, the beginning of the journey home, and the long, grinding battle for civil rights that will define the next generation. One soldier in the photograph is looking directly at the camera. His name was Sergeant Marcus Hayes, a former janitor from Birmingham, Alabama, 23 years old, holder of a Bronze Star for valor he would receive 3 months later. His expression is not triumphant. It is determined, weary, and above all, certain. Certain in a way that men who have been tested and not found wanting carry themselves. He would come home to an Alabama that still enforced segregation, that still denied him the vote, that still required him to use separate entrances and separate water fountains. But he would never again doubt his own worth, his own capability, his own right to full citizenship in the nation he had bled for. 10 years later, when a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Sergeant Hayes, by then working as a mechanic and raising 3 children, was among the first to join the bus boycott. When asked by a reporter why he was willing to walk 8 miles to work rather than ride a segregated bus, he replied, "Because I took the Gothic Line. If I can take the Gothic Line, I can walk to work." This was the transformation that Fretter Pico could not account for, that his staff officers could not explain in their reports, that the racial theories of both Nazi Germany and Jim Crow America could not accommodate. The men of the 92nd had not only defeated a military enemy, they had defeated an idea, a lie that had sustained injustice for generations. They had proven in the most undeniable way, through blood, courage, and victory, that the prejudices that had constrained them were not truths about their limitations, but lies about their oppressors' fears. The mountains of Italy still stand, indifferent to the ideologies that clashed among their peaks. The Gothic Line fortifications still scar the ridgelines, slowly being reclaimed by weather and time. And occasionally, hikers exploring those mountains find artifacts. A German helmet, an American uniform button, shell casings from weapons that are now museum pieces. But the real artifact of that January battle is not made of metal or cloth. It is carried in the memory of what was proven when a general's promise of easy victory met men who had been underestimated once too often. It lives in the fact that Fretter Pico's certainty shattered against the determination of soldiers who fought not just for victory, but for validation, not just for tactical objectives, but for the future of their children, not just against the Wehrmacht, but against the weight of history itself. In the end, his staff begged him to retreat, not because the 92nd was overwhelming in numbers or firepower, but because they recognized something more fundamental. They were fighting men who could not afford to lose, who would not accept defeat, who carried in their hearts the accumulated injustices of generations and had channeled all of it into the singular purpose of proving their worth on history's most unforgiving stage. The Gothic Line was breached not by those whom the Nazi state believed to be racially superior, nor by those whom the American establishment fully trusted, but by men whom both systems had underestimated. And in their victory lies a truth that transcends military history, that human potential cannot be measured by melanin, that courage knows no racial boundary, and that the most dangerous opponent is not the one with the most firepower, but the one with the most to prove. Fretter Pico promised to crush the 92nd. Instead, they crushed the ideology that had assured him victory. And that, in the end, was the battle that truly mattered, not just for control of Italian ridgelines, but for the soul of a civilization that would have to choose, in the years following that winter, whether to continue believing the comfortable lies of racial hierarchy, or to accept the uncomfortable truth that those soldiers proved in the mountains, that freedom, courage, and excellence belong to anyone willing to fight for them, regardless of what they have been told they cannot achieve. The snow has long since melted from those peaks, but what was forged there in January 1945 endures. In the civil rights movement that followed, in the integrated military that emerged from that war's lessons, in every barrier broken by those who were told they couldn't and decided to prove otherwise. The 92nd Infantry Division did not just take the Gothic Line. They cracked open a door to the future, one that no retreating general, no racist policy, no historical prejudice could fully close again.